Thank you everyone for joining us. I am Angela Shannon, and I'm an English professor at Bethel University in St. Paul, Minnesota. And I'm the author of Singing the Bones Together, a book of poetry. But more important than that, I am Dr. Lisa Shannon's sister. So you see that Shannon there? We're siblings. I'm blessed to be Dr. Lisa's sister. I'm going to start us with a poem, and then I'll introduce Dr. Shannon. So I chose this poem because the theme is history as well as education. So two things that Dr. Shannon is passionate about. It's called Scattering Dreams, and it's in the voice of an enslaved person during the time of slavery. So, and she's talking to her mother, and Scattering Dreams. Dear Mama, I am sitting under the umbrella tree with paper and pencil stub. Since I have learned to write, angels crowd my shoulders like Viola's wedding shawl. Mama, when I am writing, flight enters my bones. I'm planning a note for our crossing over to Jordan. I suspect we will look into the river, see our faces, see our hands wavering on the water, even see our broad feet and claim ourselves. This body belongs to me. These are my ample arms, my knobby knees, my knotted hair. Mama, I come here on Sundays at sunrise, practicing the plan. First, I write my name, Willa May. Then I write free. Then I seed my name. I say, Willa May free. To leaves, to acorns, to butterflies staring on the grass blades. The soil under my heels start whispering, nudging me to stand. Whoa, get moving. Seems like I can't stay on the ground. Those angels swooping around my pencil are the same ones fluttering about my knees, scattering dreams everywhere. So I'm going to introduce Dr. Lisa Shannon. And I know that you guys know her, but I want to do a former introduction because she is quite amazing. And sometimes it's easy, I think, to forget that. So Lisa Shannon was born in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and reared in Tampa, Florida. After attending the University of Southern California and the University of Florida, she earned a BA in Africana Studies, a MA in History, and a PhD in History, each from Georgia State University, where she has taught since 2009. She serves as lecturer and director of undergraduates in the Department of Africana Studies. Shannon is a historian whose work focuses on community relations, grassroots activism, and Southern American culture. Her forthcoming publication, Creating Community, A History of the East Washington Community in East Point, Georgia, explores the inception, evolution, and survival techniques of one of Georgia's most resilient African-American communities. Her community activism stems from her long lineage of community activists, a mother of two Georgia State University alumni, and a grandmother. Dr. Shannon believes that her mission is to teach, quote, the community that we serve is broad, very diverse, and non-discriminatory. It pleases me to see students grow academically, socially, and culturally, end of quote. It's my pleasure to interview and to talk with Dr. Shannon as she shares the history of East Washington community. Dr. Shannon will start us off with libations.
Thank you, Mrs. Angela Shannon Preston. Good evening, everyone. Thank y'all for getting on. A special thank you, as usual, to our visionary of the Freedom Schools, the chair of the Department of Africana Studies, Dr. Jonathan Gales, along with the organizer of Freedom Schools, Dr. Lakita Bonnet Bailey. Between the two of them, this is Freedom School Series 4.0. So I thank y'all for getting on. A huge thanks also to the people behind the scenes, Auburn Avenue Research Library, Morris Gardner and all of his colleagues who keep this running. And then of course, a special thanks to all of my scholars whom I get the privilege. It is an honor to teach y'all. So I thank y'all for getting on, all of my friends who are on. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I'm gonna start sharing my screen right now. Y'all, my scholars definitely know that I teach from a PowerPoint. Hopefully I'll actually look at the PowerPoint and go from it. You know, I try to do that. So Mrs. Shannon Preston, do you see that? Are you seeing the PowerPoint right now?
Yes, I am.
Good, thank you. I'm actually gonna start with go from the slideshow mode, see if that happens. And here we go. All right. All right, I know my scholars are laughing. I didn't need anyone to come to the board and help me. Tonight I get the privilege to talk about some of my work. And my work, most people who know me know, it's on the East Washington community in East Point, Georgia. I've been working on this in some capacity since 1998. It was my senior practicum thesis when I was in my Baba's class, Dr. Akinyele Umoja, my mentor, then mentor now. But he had us do this research project that I started on this church where I worked and where I served. And from there, it turned into my master's thesis, my doctoral dissertation, and it'll be my first real published work. I've published the other few articles, but this will be my my book. And of course, it's called Creating Community, a glimpse of the East Washington community in East Point, Georgia. I want to share that it's important to say creating community because we create the unity for our commune. And a lot of times people forget that. We invite people in, those who we want in, and sometimes strategically people are placed in and we're set in a particular place in space, which is what happened to the residents there in the East Washington community. Those of all who know me, who've attended any of my lectures, know that I have to start with a libation. And you know that a libation is an ancient ritual that just honors the people who paved the way for us to get where we are. We're not just happenstance. I didn't just get to where I am. You know, the libation itself is generally for people who have transitioned or people who have reached the age of 80 and above, and their legacy is already pinned into the community. So my libation today will be dedicated to the people who helped me pen this work. I will read all of their names. Generally, I would pour some kind of water for my libation into a plant, sending it back into the earth. And after each name, I would say Ashe. And at the end, have a closing remark. But today I'm gonna do my libation a little differently. I'm going to name all of these names, and then I'm gonna go from there and say Ashe at the end. So I remember Deacon Jewel Allen. I remember Stephen Bramlett, whose grandfather was a Grand Dragon in the Ku Klux Klan, chapter 51, there in East Point and Hateville, and it was Steve Bramlett this European American man who kept all of these records of what was happening in the Black community. And he knew someday, he said somebody was going to come ask about this community. And I was that someone who showed up there in East Point at the Historical Society in probably around 1994. And he just handed over so many records, some of the pictures that you will see today. But I remember Stephen Bramlett. I remember Charles Chambers. I remember Carrie Clements Johnson, one of the teachers there who's still with us today. I remember her, one of the first teachers honored in Fulton County School Board, one of the first African-American teachers honored. I remember Elizabeth and Emery Darden, Deacon and Mrs. Darden, who talked about so much of their history coming up from Upson County, Georgia, to this area. I remember James Dominic, who's still with us, but is of the age of 80, and his parents living right there in the corner. I remember Charles Dowdell. I remember Andrew Dyer, William E. Fry, Olin Gunnan, and Oral Jean Gunnan, European American couple who served in World War II, who were politicians right there, and who literally told me, you know, here comes the little colored girl coming again. Olin was a member of the Klan, and he shared that with me, and he talked about his transformation after meeting colored people in World War II and in the East Washington community, and how he had just changed because of meeting even people like this little Negro girl, which is what he called me. But in spite of all of the hidden racist stuff that people would say, I still have to pay tribute to them. I remember Herbert Holmes, Michael Holmes. These are the brothers of Hamilton Holmes, who I will speak of. I remember Gladys and James Jackson, whose pictures are right there. Oh, James Jackson, called Mr. East Point, who knew so much, a living encyclopedia, the first African-American to actually run for office there in East Point. I remember them. Irene King, oh my gosh, still with us, 80 years old, one of my good friends, her legacy, who helped tell me so much stuff about East Washington. John Henry Langford, Patricia Graham Langford's husband. I remember Mr. Langford, how he talked with me and shared with me so many stories about even when the Klan had come in and pulled his father out the house and beat his father, and his wife, Patricia Graham Langford. Oh my gosh. Sister Langford, who was the first African-American woman elected there to Ward B, right there where our church was. Thank you, Sister Langford. I'm so glad you're still with us. I remember Irma Dyer Lemons. I remember Mother Martin, Mrs. Ann Martin, and Reverend Martin. I remember Gloria Jean McDowell, who's still with us, who turned 80 on January the 17th. The stories she told me. I remember Annie Parham, Anita Parham, who's transitioned, but there's stories about right there in Glenpool. I remember Sam Roberts, one of the best friends of Mr. James Jackson. Oh, Mr. Roberts told me so many stories. He even told me a story about a lynching that was right there on Cherry Street. And then I remember Ellen Rucker Tootie, her voice, Tootie talking to me about growing up there with her sisters, but a voice that could parallel Aretha Franklin any day of the week. Oh, Miss Tootie, how I miss you. And then Brother Scott. I remember Brother Scott. He sold all of the snacks after church there. And he told me so many stories of the community that they built. And Lily Smith, oh my goodness, Miss Lily, birthday February the 20th, one of the first women who actually served, who worked in the cafeteria at the school, East Point Colored School, that later became KIPP South Fulton, where I worked. Miss Lily, I remember you, and I thank you for all that you did, how you loved me. I remember Charles Strickland. I remember Charlene Watts Addy. And then I remember, of course, Wanda Williams. I remember on the side, two of my mentors, two of my professors, I will start with Dr. Clifford Kuhn, Georgia State's a world-renowned oral historian who shared my master's and my doctorate, my dissertation. I remember you, Dr. Kuhn, and of course I remember Dr. Rouse. My students know who she is. She created the first African-American course there at Georgia State. She wrote a phenomenal book on Virginia Burns' Hope, but both of my mentors and my professors who guided me through this work. So for you, all of the names that I remember today, the names that my memory has forgotten, I tell you, thank you, community members, for just making the time to create this community called the East Washington community in spite of its strategic inception. I thank you for making such a safe haven for people. I thank you for all that you've done. I remember you. I remember your legacy. We thank the Creator for you, and we say Ashe. All right, so now my abstract. It's important for me to read this because you're going to get the rest of the slides I'll kind of go through kind of quickly. But it's important to note that the inception of the East Washington community, located there in East Point, Georgia, was immediate, it was strategic, and it was racist. This African-American community was created in 1912 when the city council passed its first residential segregation ordinance. My research uses oral histories and other documents to reveal the survival techniques that enabled the East Washington residents to endure the turmoil of Jim and Jane Crow racial segregation from the community's 1912 inception through urban renewal, integration, white flight, and the return of African Americans in the 1980s that resulted in their population majority. First, it identifies the people who chose to migrate to this area, where they came from, and what enticed them to settle there in East Point. They chose to come. Secondly, the work discusses the network of institutions that they built and depended upon, including the over 50 businesses, lodges, schools, and churches in order to maintain a largely autonomous community. Finally, it demonstrates the methods that East Washington citizens employed to build a community that educated, protected, and nurtured children who became elected city officials, fire chiefs, professors, attorneys, physicians, teachers, dentists, human rights activists, and productive citizens throughout the world. East Point itself got its name because of the railroads. It's strategically located, the city itself, where the Atlanta and LaGrange Railroad and the Macon and Western railroads meet. And at the easternmost part of where they meet is where the name comes from, thus East Point. The city was incorporated in 1887. And this becomes important because right where the railroads are, which was of course the primary mode of business transportation at the time, the Black community was strategically placed right next to this railroad. So I usually would enlarge this, but this shows the city limits of East Point from 1905, and then actually 1887, the inner line, and then the outer line, the squares, goes until until 1905. And so in 1912 rather, several citizens were present, and they spoke to the mayor and the city council, and they wanted the Negroes who lived on Chattahoochee Avenue to move. They wanted them gone. They did not want to live next door to them. Well, one of the reasons that my work became so important is because, from my knowledge, East Point became the first city in the state of Georgia that legally mandated segregation depending upon where someone lived. And it told people for the first time, this is where Black people had to live. Blacks, no other ethnicity were told this except Black people. And this happened in 1912. Other communities started happening in 1913. But from all the data that I've discovered since all of my research, which has been going on for almost 30 years now, East Point's mandate was the first. And so the mandate said it shall be unlawful for any person of color or of African descent to reside on the following streets in the city of East Point, to wit, and it was Chattahoochee Avenue and Main Street, between Chattahoochee Avenue and Vesta Avenue, where three African Americans lived. Three African American families lived, wealthy families during that time. And any person guilty of the violation of the ordinance on conviction thereof will be punished as prescribed in Section 9 of the Code of Ordinance of the said cities. All ordinance in conflict with this ordinance were repealed, and that became law in the city of East Point in 1912. One family, one primary family, the main family who was attacked was Hamilton Mayu Holmes, Dr. Holmes. Most people in Atlanta know this name. Hamilton Holmes, there are streets named, there are communities named after Dr. Holmes. Also, there is another Hamilton Holmes that we all know too, who integrated the University System of Georgia, UGA, along with Charlene Hunter Galt. So I want to read this slide too, because this slide becomes important. I mean, it goes back, but then it'll come forth. You'll get the meaning of it. But on September 7th, 1937, McLaren, we'll learn who he is soon, was provided a supporter in Zale for education when Alice Carey Holmes Washington was appointed by the Fulton County Board of Education to assist the Bayard School. Washington, the daughter of Dr. and Mrs. Hamilton Mayo Holmes, was born in East Point. A member of Atlanta's and East Point's Black elite, a Spelman graduate, and a passionate human rights activist, Washington came from a family who fought Jim Crow injustices for decades. Her father was East Washington's first African-American physician. He crossed racial barriers often by assisting Black and white patients. Her mother, Patty Lee Reeves Holmes, earned a nursing degree from St. Augustine College in Raleigh, North Carolina. Alice Washington's brother, Alfred Fontaine Tuck Holmes, along with several family friends, integrated Atlanta's public golf courses in 1955. Her nephew, Hamilton Earl Hamp Holmes, Alfred's son, integrated the University of Georgia, along with Charlene Hunter Galt in 1961. He was also the first African-American admitted into Emory University School of Medicine in 1963. Alice Holmes Washington's nephew, Michael Holmes, Alfred's son and Hamp's brother, was the first African-American to attend and graduate from Stanford University School of Business with an MBA. Well, doing my research, I had the privilege to interview Alice Carey Holmes, Washington, also Michael Holmes and Herbert Holmes. And as you see in the pictures, that's Alice right there sitting next to her mother, along with standing right behind Alice is her brother, Hamilton Mayo Holmes Jr., who was Hamilton Holmes' father. And Hamilton Holmes, of course, is who integrated Georgia, so the University of Georgia. So these are the kind of people who lived in East Point. It was this family, one of three, who was forced to move. So what they did, they're saying you can either move to, let me show you the next slide here. What African Americans had to move was 3 streets. And on this slide, right next to 6, to my right of the number 6, you will see East Washington Avenue. African Americans were forced to live between East Washington, Georgia Avenue, and Holcomb, and that was it. Right there next to the railroads. And Dr. Holmes said, you're not going to tell me where I'm going to live. You're not going to tell me what patients I can have. So what he did, he moved to Atlanta. He moved over by the AU Center. That's what he did. Well, quite a few African Americans did not have the privilege just to move. He had the means, but a lot of people were coming from South Georgia. Most of the people who I spoke with came up voluntarily from South Georgia because one of these 7 factories they could get a job at, even though they were the menial jobs that most people didn't want, to people from rural who were sharecropping, who were escaping the boll weevil and other things. East Point, it was a lively place. They had protection, a lot more protection, living in clans, and instead of in rural areas, they have protection from a lot of the racism that whites were doing. And so they chose to come up to East Washington, and they chose to come as family units generally. And so this right here is a Sanborn map, and it shows the railroads. It also shows just pictures of just like the little small houses that you can see at the top, because when people came, they actually were given lumber and they were required to build their own houses. And their earnings, from their earnings, the rent came straight out of their check. So it was almost a gotcha system. If you didn't work, you didn't have any earnings, and more importantly, the top of your earnings went right back to the same people who gave you your check in the first place. So it's a little bit better than sharecropping, but still sort of like a sharecropping system, because the people still didn't own the land, and even the shanty houses that they built. But it's still important to know that it was a choice. All right, and make sure y'all, if y'all have any questions, you're welcome to put them in the chat. This is a picture. One of the men who I interviewed, of course, was Charles Strickland. Well, this is a picture of his grandfather, and his grandfather was Mr. Ben Banks, the only European American here in the picture. Of course, we could not. I couldn't get the names of the African American men, our ancestors, in this picture, but this is them working there on the railroad. This was important to me because one of the things, as my scholars know, just because someone's skin to me doesn't mean they're kin to me. I worked with, to get my resources, to get my papers, to get my documents. I interviewed primarily African Americans, but I got my supporting evidence from a lot, probably 90% of my supporting evidence came from some of the European Americans that I ended up meeting along the way. So Ben Banks, Charles Strickland was his grandson, and he was happy to tell the story of his grandfather, Ben Banks, how he was able to, move up and buy a beautiful house there, and, not realizing that these 5 Black men who served under him, they didn't have that luxury. They still had to live in the same area, no matter their income, and had very few chances of upward mobility, but still created a phenomenal community. This picture here became important. I found it, of course, doing my research, and it was from one of the local newspapers that has since, of course, ceased. But I found this, and it was in 1938, and it was the Connolly Plantation. In the East Point area, you hear a lot with Connolly. Even another picture of mine shows actually the Connolly Cemetery. So the last enslaved huts where people stayed were actually demolished in the East Point area. And this was right there off of Washington in 1938. So I'm gonna kind of go through, this was another one. And of course, all of the at the words at the bottom describes different things, talking about the Connolly Plantation. This was Hercules Plant, Hercules Power Plant was one of the companies where African American men could serve as laborers. So I was able to get this picture, and from Mr. James Jackson, make copies and give it to a lot of the men and women in the community who had never seen, pictures of their fathers before. Like I mentioned, Deacon Darden, Deacon and Elizabeth Emery and Elizabeth Darden. Deacon Darden's father is in this picture. Gus Thornhill, oh my gosh, I love Mr. Thornhill, but Gus Thornhill Sr. is in this picture. When I took a copy of this picture to Mr. Thornhill, and I had to leave it, he was a busy man, he owned the funeral home there, and one of the 2 first African-American police officers hired in East Point too. But when I took it and left it, he contacted me and he said, I had never seen that picture. Thank you so much for giving me that. And of course, sitting to my far left was James Meadows. That's James Jackson's grandfather. So a lot of these men, I went through and put their names on each picture so that their relatives would have a copy of this. And I just remember the feeling that, that people had when they saw this for the first time. That's my father, that's my grandfather. Here are some pictures of the Shanies where people chose, on maps it looks one way, but the pictures, It's nothing like a picture, you know, and this, the housing to them, it was better. This is the community that they created. It was better. They thought it was better than where they came from. This is a optic of the Randall Street School. My work discusses the schools that were built. They are in East Washington. Randall was the second African American school that was built. And this was a wooden structure. The 4 African American schools that were built, they were strategically, fire kind of hit them every December 31st. They were purposely burned down by the Klan, basically. And so this was another.
Shannon, I hate to interrupt you, but you just mentioned Klan, and I do have a question that was put into chat that has something to do with the Klan. So how have you managed to work to build and better communities with open races and KKK members without growing tired or angry?
You do both. It hurt. Speaking with Orrin Gunnan, he and Ora Jean, his wife, they owned East Point's Historical Society. East Point gave them a house, basically it has like a railroad behind it, like a a caboose behind it. But literally all of the documents were owned by Ora Jean Gunnan, and she allowed Steve Bramlett to put the documents to order. And it was difficult, but I also knew that it was necessary. Now, as y'all know, I'm originally from Tulsa, Greenwood, 1921, you dropped the bomb on me. So I grew up with my grandparents and great grandparents telling us what happened, when that riot hit. So I knew that these stories had to exist. It is difficult. Now, my sister Angie, my scholar who's I'm speaking with right now, she's doing the work right now on Greenwood. I couldn't, if I had lived in East Washington, it would have been very difficult for me to do it. But as time goes on, it is important to put your personal stories aside, your personal feelings, and someone has to write the story. Now, East Washington, Skip Mason, phenomenal historian. He had put together, a nice collage of pictures and some, he had done a first work that was commissioned by our first African-American mayor and first woman mayor of East Point, Patsy Joe Hilliard. So he had already done a work which actually helped me. Now, what the difference between his and mine, he spoke to some of the elite members. I spoke to the everyday people whose voices probably would have never gotten heard if it hadn't have been someone, with a doctorate, y'all need education, who's going to come and pen this work and who knows how to work with different channels. So it's important when y'all write your histories, your stories, it's important to put your personal histories aside, but it is hard. And, a lot of times you leave, it's just like teaching. A lot of times you leave and you have to cry and you have to say, why me? And then you have to learn, why not you? So that was a great question, but I had to put my and y'all know I'm passionate, but I had to put my stuff aside. When I say 80% of my, of these pictures that I'm having the privilege to show y'all, 80% of them came from Klan records. And what Steve Bramlett had kept, it was a 3-drawer file cabinet about this high, just 3 drawers. Y'all have seen them before, and it was black. What was so strange about it? But literally his, it was where all the N-words, all the stuff on the N-words. Even I have in my possession a flyer from the actual lynching that was done there by the person who was lynched. His name was Zeb, Z-E-B, Zeb Long, was lynched in East Point. So I have a flyer. Come see a lynching today. That Klan flyer, I was actually, because of Steve Bramlett. So when you put your personal stuff aside, you can do primary work. Because I knew what the stories that these seniors and these elders were telling me, I knew their stories were true. But without documentation, without the police records, without the city records, without the church records, and keep in mind, most African-American churches back in the early 1900s, they weren't keeping church minutes and then giving them to city councils or the archives, the National Archives, which is right here in Georgia, where I went many times. So a lot of my church records came from white church records, where Blacks were actually renting space to go and worship in their churches. So you learn, just like you learn every day, you know, being Black in this country, looking like me in this country, you learn to maneuver and to put your personal feelings aside to get whatever you're supposed to get done. All right, I wanted to go because I know we're getting a little short on time, but one of the things that is important to understand too, while you're creating community, how people were battling Jim Crow. And so one of the things I love, speaking of Charles Hamilton Houston, people, everyone knows Thurgood Marshall. Everyone, oh my gosh, our first, oh, we're about to get a woman, you know, but okay, Lisa, stay on track. But Hamilton, I'm sorry, Thurgood attorney, the Honorable Judge Thurgood Marshall, his mentor was Charles Hamilton Houston. And so Charles Hamilton Houston is important to know that he actually started suing school systems. He started this back in the early 30s. Thurgood Marshall was helping him too, but it came from the brainchild of Attorney Houston. And so this talks about, you know, one of the things that my work talks about is how you're eradicating Jim and Jane Crow. First, you have to eradicate it through housing. And then you have to eradicate it through the education system, right? Because a lot of times you go from segregation to segregation. But I really wanted to get to this second bullet in the next slide. It's important to know what the state of Georgia was doing. Okay, so while southern states, especially the state of Georgia, observed 3 outcomes and instituted procedures to thwart integration, the NAACP searched for plaintiffs in Atlanta who would challenge segregation in Georgia's educational systems. And this is one of the things Georgia Governor Herman Talbot was prepared to counter the NAACP's integration stance. Charles Hamilton Houston was the lead attorney for the NAACP. So in 1949, he introduced Georgia's minimum foundation program for education legislation, which permitted the modernization of African-American schools in order to equalize. You're fighting the separate but equal. Most African-Americans didn't mind the separate. The problem was if it's going to be our taxes and everything, we want equal facilities. So that's how Charles Hamilton Houston was fighting this legislation. And so what the governor did, he said, okay, well, I'm going to equalize the disparities between white and Black schools. And so in an attempt to ward off these segregation, he built 500 new African-American schools, more than any other state, more than any other states at that time. He built 1 African-American high school in each of Georgia's 159 counties. And so Georgia's Board of Education established a new statewide curriculum and built modernized school facilities in urban and rural communities. Many of these, they were called the equalization schools. We're making stuff equal now. They included auditoriums, gymnasiums, and Cold War era bomb shares, all large enough to house the entire community, new desks, chalkboards, musical instruments, sports equipment, and tennis courts. In 1952, East Point Colored Elementary School and Equalization School was built. That's the school right now that KIPP South Fulton Academy is housed in. And it became a separate facility from East Point High School, which was renovated to include a gymnasium, tennis courts, and an athletic field. But people in the community were fighting for this. He wasn't just doing this, they were fighting, and they were saying at that time, Russell High School was the high school that the whites went to. Well, Russell has this, so why don't we have this? So these community people were still fighting for everything. And it's also important to know that although Governor Talmadge built 500 new schools for African Americans, he built 700 new schools for European Americans. All right. So at that time, the total cost for these 1,200 schools was over $275 million. That's extremely important to know. My slide, let me get it this way because it's not there. You go. So, and this is, if y'all remember, this is 1952. Well, in doing this research, I had people to tell me, you know, the area, the community didn't look like that in 1952. What are you talking about? You know, because people would challenge you on your research, you know, African Americans and European Americans. It wasn't that bad. And so I'm like, well, these residents are telling me the truth. You know, some of the things they're telling me about these shanty, where they're getting the wood from Fort McPherson, the smell, all of this. And if y'all look at this picture very, very, very closely, this picture stopped all of the nonsense. That's why I love pictures. Behind the trees, you will see East Point Colored Elementary School that was built in 1952. These houses are still being occupied. So this is the Bayard Circle area. So everything that these African Americans were telling me in their stories, once I hooked up with Steve, you know, and other people, I got copies of these pictures that Urban Renewal, Aura Jean Gunnan, she was part of the Urban Renewal Committee that the governor and the federal government started sending in the late 1950s. So this is some of the pictures that she had that people had never even seen before. Right? So you're looking at these pictures and behind, I'm like, what's that behind the trees? I said, oh my gosh, that's the school. This is showing everything that and people didn't know what I was doing. I'm just there being nosy and just, oh my gosh, look at this. Da, 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 da. Oh yeah, Lisa, come here, little colored girl. You know what? Literally, you know, just come here. Let me show you. Well, you would probably like this. And I saw this picture and I was like, oh my gosh, that's it. This is the proof that I need. And as soon as Dr. Kuhn saw this, he was like, we have to put this in now, because his work was living Atlanta. And then of course,
I have another question, a quick question. You kind of spoke to this a little earlier, but LaShana was wondering, you know, since you know, we mentioned your bio, you're from born in Oklahoma and grew up in Florida. She was wondering if there was one thing that sparked your interest in East Washington community, being a non-native of Atlanta.
Yes. The church, I was there at the church. I worked at, it had six churches. And we joined Nariah Baptist Church. Our neighbors were members there, and a new pastor had gotten there, and I loved my neighbors, and they asked us to come and visit, and we ended up joining. I became the secretary. And as the secretary there at the church, I was over one of the ministries that I was over it was called GAS, but it was God's Anointed Seniors. I created the ministry, and I have an affinity of speaking with elder people. A lot of my friends are even older than I am. And that's because while my mom was finishing up Langston and getting all of her education and stuff, I had the privilege, I'm the youngest of the five, of being with my grandparents between Tulsa and Sapulpa. So, you know, I was always at my grandmother's knees, either my maternal grandmother, Ethel, Lee Maynard Hickman, oh my God, I love mother, or my paternal grandmother, Willa Walker Shannon, or her mother, my great grandmother, Bertha Walker Black. So just hearing their stories and just being around older people. So going to this church and being over this ministry, one of the things I started doing was getting seniors together once a week. They would eat lunch, they would talk, they loved being together. And, you know, sometimes I would take them out. They even did limo rides and stuff, but I would just listen to them. I love listening to my elders and learning from my elders. Some of y'all know, if you ever see me, I love going into Baba's class, especially, you know, when he was in person, and just sitting in the back and just learning from them, because they're just brilliant. And just hearing their stories of how it used to be. That's how everything started with me. And, you know, so I had to do, y'all know, I had to do papers, all these Africana studies classes back in the 1990s. I think I met Bob in 1995, and he's making me do these papers, or I get to do these papers. Let me change that around. And so I said, well, you know, I'm here at the church every day. I'm listening to the seniors every day. Let's just do a work on the church. And so in Dr. Amoja's class, most of my papers were done on stuff with these seniors, and that turned into my senior practicum. So that became my love of just listening to our elders, our ancestors, where they've come from, and just appreciating their stories and then writing it.
Thank you.
Thank
Yes,
you.
Dr. Shannon, I have a question.
Okay.
What has surprised you the most, in doing all of this? Is there something that has surprised you?
Actually, yes, and I'm gonna go a little bit quicker because this will answer that question. The thing I think that surprised me the most, this is Mrs. Ann Martin. Her husband, Reverend Martin, he started Neriah in 1922. And he actually started New Hope. He had two churches in the Atlanta area. What surprised me the most was there ended up being over 50 something businesses, but I guess the subordinacy, with lack of a better word right now, of the women. Mother Martin, her husband just said he was the pastor. But I always wondered, how were they surviving? How did, mother, how did they buy this house? They bought a beautiful home over by Douglas High School in the 1960s. Well, Mother Martin, she actually had two hair salons, one on Auburn Avenue, but her first one was right there in East Washington. The resiliency of these women who they were married to, a lot of the men were deacons, but the women, they weren't just keeping the houses, they were domestics. They were working in, the schools, the white schools, in the cafeterias. And I guess just their humility and how, until I started speaking, the women, oh, I don't have, at least I don't, oh, sister, I don't have anything to say. And then finding out that they were primarily the breadwinners, besides getting up every morning, keeping their houses clean, taking care of their kids, raising their kids and helping to raise other kids, but they were the primary breadwinners. So I think that's what surprised me the most. And it didn't surprise me because my mom was a breadwinner too. My grandparents, my grandmothers were as well. What surprised me is how I didn't know, people don't know that because they didn't advertise that. Their role, Dr. Rouse would call it the code of true womanhood for Black women, and how Black women generally still get married, still have kids, but they know that one of their primary roles is to undergird their husband and never embarrass their husband in public, never. I had the privilege to watch for about the 1,000th time Hidden Figures again. And it was this scene in there, and a lot of y'all may have seen it, the scene in there when the lady who was portrayed Mary Jackson's role, when she's wanting to be the engineer, and they're at the church. And her husband she's wanting to go to school to be, to get an engineer degree, and she has to go to this white school. And her husband is telling her, I just don't want you hurt. And he's telling her, you shouldn't do it. And, he kind of tells her, no, if you were at home more, you would know that your kids, were doing this. And so she said, you don't want this female mind right here in public. And I love that because it showed that the women, you had your own mind. You had your own money. A lot of times the houses, if when you bought a house, may have been in the woman's name, but publicly, the submissive role to allow your husbands or your male counters to hold that role so that he wouldn't be embarrassed. I think I know that's what surprised me the most, and how I was so proud. Reverend Martin transitioned first, and Mother Martin transitioned latter. But after getting to know her and taping her and going to see her, everything that she did behind the scenes, I was just like, Mother Martin. But actually, the first work that Dr. Rouse, because I did a work just on Mother Martin, and that's where Dr. Rouse, she said, you have to publish Mrs., because Dr. Rouse had the privilege to meet her. And Mother Martin, Ann Martin, oh my gosh, she was a local Atlanta celebrity. And so when Dr. Rouse realized that, that I knew her, I went to Mother Martin's 90th birthday party. And, and Dr. Rouse asked if she can come. So I took her, and, she came, and she brought another of her church friends, and she was just floored, because, I was in the church, I was a church secretary. And so I knew a lot of church people. And so Dr. Rouse was like, you have to, that's the first work you have to publish on Mother Martin. So I think that's what surprised me the most. Just the humility of these phenomenal women.
And there's another question that we
Mhm.
just got, and I know we're running out, we're getting
That's
closer.
fine. That's fine. I'm at the screen where I wanted to be.
Okay. The question is by Deja, what was the best advice or information your mentor said to you while you were doing your research?
Well, I'm gonna be transparent because y'all know that's about the only way that I can be. It wasn't until 2 weeks ago, the first time I ever put Dr. Kuhn's picture up in a libation, and I fought that. And only because he and I did the chair, he was the chair of my thesis, master's, and doctorate, and we fought. I fought for everything because I had to fight for legitimacy. And so anything that I said, if you can't prove it, you can't put it anywhere. And so it was just a battle. What I learned from that now, years later, he transitioned in 2016. He was exactly right. If you can't prove, that's why a lot of times when I'm in class, I'll tell y'all, okay, argue your point, prove your point. If you can't prove it, you cannot say it as someone in the academy. And so I think that's what I learned the most. That's what I learned from him. And I think now, the older I get, the more I'm getting ready to publish my own work, the more value, which, if you try to pull up some of my work right now, it's going to come up, it's not available until I think it's 2024 now, because until it gets published, some of the things that I have, just things in my home that the world has never seen before. So that's because Dr. Kuhn kept saying, I don't care, Lisa, if 100,000 people there in that community say it. If you can't prove it, you can't put it in there. So I think that from him, and then from Dr. Rouse, from her. And if anyone knew her on this call, and I know some of my faculty members definitely, I think Dr. Elizabeth West is on. If she's on, thank you for getting on. But y'all know how much I admire her. She's one of our only full African-American women professors there at Georgia State. Phenomenal family. I just love her. But Dr. Rouse would make sure that I respected, which I don't think that we were groomed to respect our elders. But she would always say, you know who you're looking at, or you know whose eyes you're seeing through. You don't know who's looking back at you. So hers was to make sure that you stay in the people who people thought were nobodies had a voice. So I think those are the two things, blending that. Now, my main mentor, I mentioned probably 5 times, but thank God he's not 80 nor has not transitioned, Baba Umoja. I think a lot from him. I think what I've learned the most is just, I really think the value of community, and that you have a place in activism. And most of y'all who know Baba Akinyele Umoja and may have had the privilege of knowing his wife, oh my gosh, Aminata Umoja, those two together, know that what you do is not about you, it's about community building, which is one of the reasons when I put creating community together, I thought about Baba and Aminata. So I think those are the things that I think that I've learned the most in this process, in this journey, which still is not over. It's so far from being over, but I think I'm getting there. Let's put it that way.
Definitely.
How's that? Okay.
Joyce has a question. She's wondered if you had a chance to share your research with the community people who helped you.
Oh yes, I used to. Now when Steve was alive, oh my gosh, and Steve Bramlett, he had me in every February. Everybody knew I was going to be over there saying something about East Washington community. The principal, now the current principal of KIPP South Fulton, Mr. Brandon Jones, phenomenal principal. He had me actually teach to the teachers about the community where they're actually going to be coming in and teaching. The principal before him, Mrs. Siobhan Gardner, oh, she's amazing too. She would have, me to open up the school year with, the same thing about the community. But then at one time, I think I have the picture of the grave site. This is a Connolly grave site. These 2 stones represent some enslaved people who they could be buried in the white grave site. But Mrs. Gardner under her tenure as principal, we would actually go in and clean up this burial site, which is a white burial site. But that's the kind of stuff she would do. So anytime my work is actually in East Point, the Historical Society, if you ever go there. When I first went there years ago, there was nothing on Black folk. I am proud to say the last time I went, they have a whole section, including some large murals of the African-American pool there when it was O.J. Hurd. There, I mean, I have so many pictures in here of community legends. This is O.J. Hurd, who actually had the bus company, because this is before, keep in mind too, Martin wasn't going to go into African-American communities. So he had the East Washington bus company, and then he was hired by Fulton County Schools, you know, and he also did the ambulance company there, you know, in the community, and had a couple of cab companies as well. But Oscar James Hurd, O.J. Hurd, there was some government homes, a home section there. I think that's still named after him. But yes, you know, just I have a chance to speak to them a lot. I just did a radio show. Mrs. Gardner had someone call me about, because of course, being adjacent to all of these plants, there were 3 fertilizer plants. So the name is also called Stink Town, an N-word town too of this community. And so there's an environment, and it's also built on a brown field. And so my work also includes environmental racism there. And so I do a lot of research on that. But there is an environmentalist who contacted Gardner, some kind of way. Gardner is at it because Mrs. Gardner lives in East Point. So, you know, she contacted me and said, you know, this lady wants to speak with someone, and you know, Dr. Shannon, I know you know. And so I was on the radio talking about actually the smell, and if I personally felt the smell has affected the residents over
Dr.
this.
Shannon, I hate to interrupt you, but we're out of time. I want to encourage you. I don't know if you have a class that's called East Washington Community. I think it will be an excellent class to teach this information, because it's information that we all need, and it's important information. So I thank you so much for doing this. And again, I think this will be an amazing class to do. I do need to invite everyone to the next Freedom School event, which is on March the 9th. And it's Afrofuturism, Black Imagining and Historical Records and Television, a conversation with Dr. Jonathan Kidd. Dr. Kidd is a writer, TV producer who has worked on Lovecraft Country in NCIS, New Orleans, and it will be moderated by Leah Boscom. So that would be the 9th. Bascom. Thank you so much for joining us. And I think we've reached our time limit. Thank you for being here. Great job, Dr. Shannon. It was wonderful.
Thank you all. I'll see some of y'all in class tomorrow. Thanks, Auburn Avenue.